At the pinnacle of his power, a man risks losing control. The world is not kind, so its kings become cruel. Murder is never mercy, it's never noble, and it's never redeemable. To the maniac, murder is an art form.
What is happening to God say something?
Welcome back to Visited by Voices Live on a early Saturday edition. This month we will be running matinees on Saturdays rather than the later shows that we do through the week. And today I'm joined by someone who's fighting on the front lines of horror every day. And I use that word very literally in today's world. It is a tough world out there, especially in the literary sphere, to get traction, to get purchase. There's a lot of reasons for that, and we'll get into it. But not merely a foot soldier, a general in this war. I'm joined by Danielle Trussoni.
Hey, Lauren. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
It's great having you here. So to those who don't know who you are, we need to fix that immediately. But there's two things that are going on simultaneously with you. You're not quite a jack of all trades, but you wear a lot of hats, right?
Yeah, I do. So I, first and foremost, I'm a novelist. I wrote a book called, I have them here. This book was my first novel, Angelology. And then I have a new book that just came out called The Ancestor, right here. And so, yeah, I'm a novelist. I've published 5 books. And, really that's all I was doing for a long time. And then about 2.5 years ago, I was approached by the New York Times to write the horror column for their book review, which I have to say has been one of my favorite things ever. And so now I write it's about quarterly, sometimes more than that, review of horror fiction and select nonfiction. There's a few, nonfiction studies of horror that I also have reviewed in the Times. And it's been this amazing experience that has allowed me to discover what's being written now. I get, tons of books come to my house every month. And now it's very digital, right? Get lots of e-galleys. But, it was kind of a boon for me because, and I'm sure we can talk about this more, I have always loved horror and the horror genre in different forms, but I really was kind of stuck in foundational horror or like early horror or horror of my childhood, books that I had loved growing up. And I really was not reading as much of contemporary horror as I wanted to. So this gave me not only access, because I get everything even before it comes out, but it gave me time and some motivation to go and just like rediscover everything that's happening now.
Yeah, and it's so incredible to think that the New York Times book review would even make the room to cover.
I'm so glad they did. Yeah,
it's not happening out there. It's just not.
No.
So to have the most mainstream, reputable book review out there give you the space is, to me, is a testament to you, but it's also a testament to the hope that the future is a little bit brighter for the genre.
I think it is. I am very optimistic. I think we're in a renaissance right now, to be frank, of horror writing. Particularly what I'm finding is that there's some amazing Gothic writing in the literary sphere happening. And of course, we all know in film, that horror is really sort of where it's at now. After Parasite winning an Academy Award and Get Out winning an Academy Award, and not to mention all the other wonderful horror films that have come out recently that have really just, taken it to a new level. I think we're in a renaissance for horror in general, not just, books or film, but I think together it's really going to push it over the edge again.
Absolutely. And we'll get to film and pet theory of mine about the ancestor before we're done, because I think it would fit in completely perfectly with what A24 are doing with their literate horror films. I think it would fit. If there's one novel out there that would just fit perfectly into the niche that they've built, I think you wrote it.
Well,
and I mean that as
let's
pretty
call
high
them up.
Let's do it right now.
Let's call them.
Unfortunately, I don't know anyone at A24. I probably can get some people. I can get some people from the film business on the line, but no one from A24. They're not taking my calls at this point.
Yeah, I haven't really talked much about it, but I do have some exciting news on that front. A really,
I think I know it.
Fabulous director optioned. How do you know it? Do you know it?
Well, let me ask you, did he direct a James Bond film in the past?
No, he didn't. I don't think so. No.
He didn't. Maybe I don't know it then.
Maybe you don't know it. If you do know it, tell me, because I don't know that information. Maybe you know something I don't know. No, a director named Mark Romanek, who is that what you heard? I want to know your sources. And Anonymous Content have optioned it with me to co-write with him. And he did, do you know the film Never Let Me Go from 2010? It was an adaptation of a Kazuo Ishiguro novel that was very intense and dark, and on that literary horror line. And so we haven't made an announcement yet. It's so new. And I haven't really talked about it much, but you're the first to know.
Well, there you go. Breaking news on the show. Well, this isn't the first project that has been that the rights have been sold. It's not even optioned. You've sold rights before, though, right?
Yeah. Oh, Angelology sold outright before the book was even bought. So it sold as a manuscript.
And that was a bidding war for that thing between
that was
names.
A shocker.
I mean, when you have Will Smith as a producer looking at the project saying, I want to do something here. That's a pretty good way to start a literary career. Yeah,
it was a good first novel, right? Unfortunately, they never made it. So, it really, it's a double-edged sword, right? You sell something and there's a bidding war and it sells for a good amount of money and it gets enough, high profile publicity, but then when they don't make it, you're kind of stuck.
But that does mean, well, they bought it outright. You see, it's better because you made more money than if it was just been optioned, but by the same rate, you could sell an option.
Yeah, well,
once it expires.
So it technically has gone back to me, but there's a clause in any buyout when producers buy something directly, it's called turnaround costs. You have to pay them back if someone else buys it. So, we actually had that it's set up as a television show right before the pandemic, and then the pandemic hit and that deal just fell apart.
I was about to say to you, because the Angelology line, the series, to me screams like premium cable show more than film anyway, just because there's too much there.
So complicated. It's like it goes all the way back like more than 1,000 years of history and biblical, biblical mythology and a contemporary story, a World War II story. Like it really just goes all over the place. So yeah, you're right. I see it as a television show eventually too.
Yeah, but we want to make sure it gets somewhere that gives it the room too, because I was very excited when the adaptation from AMC of The Terror was announced.
Yes.
But I think they rushed it. I think it needed a lot more room than they gave it. So rather than a second season, I would have preferred them to stop at the halfway point and let it breathe and do the second half of the story as a second season. Yeah. So one of the commenters out there is already in with something that you need to see. Jacob says, unfortunately, I've only read Falling Through the Earth as it was recommended to me. It is rare that I enjoy memoirs or first-person account stories. Falling Through the Earth was fantastic.
Oh, well, thank you, Jacob. That was my first book, and it was a memoir. And it's not really horror. It's horror of a different variety, right? It's real life horror and trauma. So Yeah, thank you, Jacob. I'm glad you liked it. I think that you might like my horror novels too, if you liked that.
Jacob is a regular commenter on all the streams that have literary guests, so I think you're very right that he would enjoy The Ancestor at the very least. I mean, the Angelology is I haven't read all of them. I read the first, and I own the second, but I have not yet finished. I have not yet picked it up to really read it. But they're more overtly fantastical.
There's a fantastical element, right? The premise is that in the Bible, in a certain passage in the Bible, there's the implication that Nephilim, which are half human, half angel creatures, are actually living on the earth. And I took that premise and said, okay, that's true. Now, what if everything that is terrible that's happening in the world is because of that? And sort of built a mythology and a world. It's really, but the thing is that it's hard to categorize. And I think that that's been a problem for that book too, because it's not technically literary fiction. It's not technically fantasy. It's not technically historical fiction. It's not technically horror, but it's a kind of blend of all of those things. And The Ancestor is a little bit like that too, which, to get to that, like, I just really love books that cross genres and mix it all up and surprise my readers. So I'm less concerned with labeling it than just creating something enjoyable.
Yeah, well, I think that that's actually where fiction needs to go, period. I think that I'm always saying, like, let's let everything from the past that we love kind of not die, but fade away, because we need room for the new. And it's not really, I don't consider what you did with The Ancestor like crossing genre. I just think you went where the story needed to go very, very organically. And,
well, thank you. I agree.
I mean, you probably have a better elevator pitch for your book than I do, but it's a novel about Alberta, a woman who is suffering through the after effects of having a miscarriage, who inherits family property in Italy she didn't know she had, and that leads her to some pretty excruciating examination of the humanity of family lines. Is that the fairest way, without spoiling anything, to describe it?
I think that that's a great way to describe it. I think that that's the best way. Basically, it's the very short description is that it's about one woman's journey to discover her family history and discovers that it's not quite human. And it's really an examination of what does it mean to be human, and also what are tribes, right? Like, I feel like we live in this sort of tribal society where people divide into groups, and this book really explodes that, because it's like, what does that mean on every level?
Yeah, it seems like we're more tribal today than we've ever been. And I mean, one of the rules I have on this show, we skirt it sometimes, but religion and politics are the two places I don't really want to go with the show. But the division that we face today is, I think, as stark as it's ever been.
Yeah,
and
I agree.
I don't think it's a healthy place to be, no matter what side anyone chooses. I think that in reality, all good people need to come together, and I think that in a way is kind of part of the subject of The Ancestor anyway.
It's definitely a sub plot.
Because it's easy. It's easy. Part of it is kind of like, sometimes when you look in the mirror too long, you won't like what you see. And I think that's most great horror comes back to that at some point. I mean, at the beginning of my videos, I start with a definition of the horror genre. And it came up real quick. I'm not sure if you had a chance to read it. Everyone out in watching this is well aware of it. But my definition of horror is horror, a genre of the dramatic arts that seeks to elicit a response from within an array of dark emotions: fear, anxiety, disgust, paranoia, terror, stress, gallows humor, etc. And the reason I have that broad of a definition is because I think that the only way we grow is to stop necessarily trying to scare or gross out. It has to be more. It has to be making people feel things that they've never felt before. And that's certainly true in The Ancestor.
Yeah, well, I love that definition, but I would, my own definition encompasses, I think it's just an element of that, in that I think one of the reasons that horror is so successful over hundreds of years, right? Because horror novels have been some of the very first novels that were ever written, is because of the introduction of wonder and awe and almost this Lovecraftian inability to comprehend some of the emotions that we have when confronted with the world. And so the emotional part of horror, I think, is a big draw, especially now. I've said this a few times in other interviews, but in a world where everything is so emotional, right? Our political interactions are emotional. The news is so emotional. We're living in such a terrifying time in some ways. A genre like horror that allows us to feel intensely about something can compete with that. And it becomes important because it's not only just mimicking life, but it is actually bringing us up to a level where we can deal with the exterior world in a new way. So I love that definition that you had.
Well, I did the writing groups thing for years, trying to find a group where I fit, and I found out basically I don't fit into writing groups. But the conversation always came up, how do you define what we're trying to do here? The horror genre is tough. The Western's easier because it's all setting, right? And science fiction, it's speculative. It's thinking about the future. But horror can be all those things. There's no reason you can't set a horror film in the Old West, and there's no war on a spaceship.
Sure. Yeah, I think the Horror Writers Association defines horror as a feeling, right? Like a feeling of dread or the sensation of terror that arises from a situation. And that, if you think about it, that's so amorphous, right? We could say that the New York Times front page is horror then.
More often than not.
More often than not, right? So I don't know. It is a very amorphous and mutable definition, but I do think that horror is one of those genres that benefits from not having those definitions. I think we know it when we see it, right? We know it when we're reading it, and we feel it, and that's good and that's bad, but it allows horror to keep surviving through time and always remain relevant.
Yeah, and I think that it's interesting because there seems to be two, in the literary world anyway, there's two worlds of horror. There is the people who have always written horror, who are marketed as horror, very straightforward. Mm-hmm. And then you have this new class over the last 10 years or so have come up who are marketed more as literary, which is, by the way, I have problems with that terminology because I think literary should be something that time bears out, not is a marketing term to begin with, but like Ania Alborn or Stephen Graham Jones or Sylvia Moreno Garcia, all of which have released excellent work within the last 16 months. Mm-hmm. All of them are kind of marketed as mainstream literary fiction more so than horror, but it's kind of impossible not to see the incredible impact they're having on the genre. I mean, someone like a Paul Tremblay or a Jeffrey Ford is more marketed towards horror, not as far as, say, your Brian Keens are, right?
Right.
So there's this whole spectrum of how the world is expected to, or there's an entire spectrum of how people can consume horror. We can read it all, but we're gonna have to look in different parts of the bookstore.
Yeah, so this gets me on my perpetual tirade against genre labels. I really hate them. I don't like things being, marketed as literary or horror or sci-fi or whatever. I think good writing is good writing. And so, when I choose something for my column, sometimes it maybe isn't what some people would call horror. And, then on the other side of it, there are books that are definitely within the horror genre that people in the so-called literary side wouldn't consider worth reading. But I don't buy this at all. Like, if it does something to me as a reader, if it engages me, if it draws me in, entertains me, frightens me, or makes me think, then for me, that belongs in my column. And, I frankly, as someone who's been a victim in some ways of many of these labels, my first novel, my first book that Jacob mentioned, Falling Through the Earth, was marketed as very literary memoir, right? Like hyper literary. And okay, like what does that mean? Did it cut off like more commercial readers who liked memoir in general? Did it cut off, certain other kinds of readers from me? Who knows? And then, The Ancestor was definitely marketed as horror. So what changed, right? Me as a writer and my style and my interests over the course of my career have not changed, but the labels have changed, which has sort of, like balkanized my audience a little bit, like, cut up I would rather just have people who like my writing to just like my writing. And I think it's the same with a lot of horror fans too, right? They would like to be able to just read great horror. It doesn't matter if it's considered literary or non-literary or experimental or not or whatever. So anyway, it's all about taste, but to really just get to the heart of it, it's about people in publishing houses figuring out how to market things, right? And they're the ones that put those labels on these books, and then they get shipped out to bookstores, and then they get shelved in those sections. And that's how it works. I think, and you probably have some thoughts about this too, that the world is changing and we're moving into a sort of almost post-physical bookstore reality. Unfortunately, I love bookstores, but I think that it's going to be much less dependent on those kinds of marketing labels, what we find, and more dependent on creators and writers and communities of people who are reading and watching horror films and recommending books to each other, like you're doing. I think you're like really at the forefront of how this is going to move into the future. And hopefully we can shape it in a way that, that provides a really good service to readers and film viewers. Like, we have taste, right? We're curating things for people who want to read these books, who want to see these films, and we have a responsibility to do the best job we can. But, we do it from a place of admiration, and we're real fans. So I think that it's all in the best light. It's not us out there trying to like market something or categorize it. So that's my spiel, but I feel very strongly about the whole idea of genres and categories and marketing. And
I think as a shorthand to help people discover more work in a vein of something they liked previously, it can be helpful. But when it starts to inform how people can come across things at all, then it actually starts to defeat its own purpose. So in other words, in the chat right now, there's a discussion about whether Silence of the Lambs qualifies as horror.
Oh, really?
And
what do you think?
Oh, definitely.
I think it does too. I was going to say, wow, I'm surprised people. What is it because? Is it because the main action is basically it's the FBI agent that's out doing the action rather than we're not really seeing the, Hannibal's.
Well, again, if I go back to
work.
my definition, though, Will Graham is just as horrific as Lecter or Dollarhide, because his struggles and what he puts himself through, because he knows it's going to save lives, but he puts himself in this mind space that's just horrific. It's horrible. That's as much horror as any of the serial killings to me.
Yeah.
Now I came about it differently. I read the novel before Manhunter was even made.
Yeah.
So I mean, someone who just comes from just seeing the film may come at it differently, but I also have this annoying thought in my head that keeps reoccurring, that once something that is really successful, people just want to remove it from the horror genre. Just well, no, I mean, I've heard people ask, is Jaws a horror movie?
Oh my God. Yeah.
The poster uses the word terrifying twice.
Mm.
I think it's telling us what it is. Just because it's really well done and it's really beloved and it's now an evergreen title in both fiction and film doesn't mean we just should throw out the word. It doesn't have to be a pejorative.
Yeah, I've heard that with Get Out too, right? Like I'll say, oh yeah, horror film, Get Out, love it. And people will say, oh, that's not horror. That's more political. It's more, and I'm like, what? That is 100% a horror film. It's a great horror film. And that's what the genre is, right? We have great stuff.
Who said horror couldn't be political?
Right, of course. Who said horror couldn't be any variety of things?
Absolutely. And I always go back to the fact that my favorite film of all time is The Bride of Frankenstein, which on its surface is just a really fractured fairy tale.
Mm.
But it fits so nicely in the genre. But the places it takes me, the things it makes me feel, even on my, I don't know, 90th watch, is just so strong. And it makes me a better person to have felt those things.
Yeah.
So it's weird that dark emotions can make better people.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I mean, if we don't explore the, all of the realms of our consciousness, if we want to get into it, and the darker side of us, like, how do we know who we are, right? I think that it's really important, and something that I'm writing a new novel now, and something that I'm really exploring in this new book is exactly that. Like, what is consciousness? What does this dark side of consciousness mean? And how does it relate to us as human beings?
I think there's so much to play with there. Again, I think horror comes back to identity at some point. It's that whole looking in the mirror thing, because we experience life single directional, right? We have two sets of eyes. Well, most of us have a set of eyes. I don't have a sense of smell, so I don't have that. But we have our senses, and that's how we have to perceive the whole world through that prism. We don't have any other choice. Everything else is secondhand. The idea, though, that perhaps what we consider firsthand may not be the case, that old hard solipsism, I think that is almost the basis of all horror in a way.
Yeah. And also the fact that, maybe we are the monsters, right? Like this ambiguity between what is good and what is evil, what is terrifying and what isn't, that's perpetually interesting to me.
And the fact that Richard Matheson did it so well doesn't mean there's not a lot of room, because we're still trying to figure it out as a people. So
yeah, I mean, come on, we could go back all the way to the Greeks, right? People poking their eyes out. Like, I think that it's been done forever. This is a human question, and it's, as long as there's new generations of people, like, and we're in different sort of a different era, it's going to always be interesting.
Yeah, another common thread on all these shows is that I really believe that horror is the most direct descendant from the Greek tragedy. It's the least molested along the period of time and literary tradition. Comedy has almost completely lost its foundations from what it originally was. Now it's just, if it makes us laugh, it's comedy. But horror has been used as a way to shape society through the ages. And I think it still is. It's just not respected for the work it's doing.
Agreed. But I think that that's going to change. I honestly do. Like, I think it's very interesting to me. I've been invited to talk about horror, to library groups and book clubs and, sort of groups that normally wouldn't be discussing a horror novel, right? And they'll say things like, "Oh, I so enjoyed your book. I'm surprised it's horror." And then you start really talking to them, though, about the books that they love. And actually, half of them are horror. And actually, people do love horror. It's just, I think that the name somehow has become saturated in like 70s and 80s, maybe slasher, in people's consciousness. They only see it as this little slice of Clive Barker type, sort of cut 'em up novels, or in film, same thing, right? The teenage bloodbath sort of novel or film. But it's so much, as it's so much more than that. And when you really start peeling back the surface, and people start actually saying, "Oh yeah, I love the Brontes, for example, historically speaking," or I love this other novel, and you realize that actually they're horror fans and they don't even realize it.
And modernly, that's still true. Toni Morrison's Beloved is a ghost story.
For sure,
and,
yeah.
Well, I mean, it opens with an invisible spirit throwing the family dog around until its eye pops out. I mean, that should be a hint that she was playing in some pretty dark waters. But people got focused on the fact that there was such a strong social message in the story, and such a compelling one too, because I'm not the one for social messages if you can't write. If you're a bad writer, stay away from them. Because if you can't do it well, don't preach at anyone. You're not going to sell books. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
But in the case of Toni Morrison, obviously a world-class writer, it becomes this powerful brew. But again, how is that marketed? Not as horror.
definitely not. And even now, it's occasionally thrown in with what I've seen a few times, like recently. But this is what I'm saying. I think that in the last year or so, there's a real renaissance, because people in the literary world, the literary gatekeepers, are starting to say, "Oh, you can have this sort of upscale, literary horror," and it's like, it's good on many levels, but that's what they needed, I think, to open it up and start actually saying that, recommending horror, rather than just pushing it away.
Hallelujah. We just got to keep them on page. That's the important thing. So Jess Graham has a question or a request from you. But before we get there, I want to talk about something really similar. Because very recently, as in days ago, you participated in a panel on Gothic horror films.
I did, and I was in the middle of a storm. I don't know if you were listening to it. I was in the middle of a storm, and we had no electricity, and I had candles everywhere. It was very Gothic. And then my phone died. So I was only there for the first 15, 20 minutes. But yes, it was fabulous.
Unfortunately, I lost power before you did.
Yeah, I think everyone lost power in this area.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much. The difference is I got power back yesterday.
Oh my God, where are you?
I'm in Jersey.
Okay, yeah. So I'm just on the Hudson River, a little bit north of you, probably. Yeah, no, I know. I have friends who didn't get it back till yesterday as well.
What's that Lovecraft line? Cold, dark, and wet. That's what scares us, right? We had all that going on for a few days.
And your food rotting. Like, I know. I was like, oh, great. Okay, everything in the fridge has to go away. And
I have a generator, and so I was able to keep the refrigerator and the freezer alive, but it only gave me 2 other power outlets and water. So
wow,
I felt like it was like we were Gilligan's Island here. I was going to get on the bike, the bamboo bike, and start pedaling for electricity. Jess Graham does say, though, he would love to hear about Danielle's experience with her studies at the University of Iowa's Writers' Workshop.
Oh, yeah. So I did do an MFA at Iowa. It was great. It's very competitive. I don't know if people who are here know anything about it. It's an MFA program that they're very selective, and they only bring in 25 people. And there's thousands of applications. So when you get there, people are a little bit competitive with each other as well. And at that point in my career, well, I mean, I didn't even have a career. At that point in my desire to be a writer, I just really needed the time and space to write. So I ended up, it ended up being really good for me because I did have 2 full years to write. And, I think in some ways it helped me get an agent later. But I don't know. I mean, I hear a lot of questioning from people like, do you get an MFA or do you just go out in the world and write? Like, what do people who are starting to write and really want to go on that path. And it's a place like Iowa, if you get in, yes, it's worth going. And, having guidance, it's really worth it. My teachers were great, and some of the other students were great too. But I think that you really have to be careful about whose hands you put your work into. You want to find encouragement. You don't want to be someone. I had a lot of people reading my work saying, "This is too. What is this? This is too crazy, or this is too." I mean, the word now that I guess they would have used would have been horror, right? But because I was always writing that way. But that's not the kind of stories that were in that MFA program. So it was, it was frustrating at some point. So I would definitely be really careful about finding the right place to go if you're going to go.
The one thing I'd say is very safe for anyone there's a big difference between my level of success and Danielle. She's way above me, but no matter what, write every day.
Oh yeah, right every day.
That's
very good advice.
So I'm a high school graduate. She's put out what I think is probably the best horror novel of the year, probably the best novel of the year in my opinion. But if you don't write every day, no class is going to make enough difference. I just feel like you can learn by doing. Also, read in genre. You get this advice from a lot of people that, read outside the genre for good, but you can find so much good writing in the genre. I don't think you have to leave it, and you stay in touch with what's going on. I was talking to Hildy Silverman 2 days ago on the show, without power, by the way. The generator was at that point
with your
running.
generator. Oh my God.
Yeah, it was touch and go, but for 12 years she ran Space and Time, a magazine, and the big thing she came out and said, read in the genre you're writing in, because she had to deal with those slush piles and people who were just repeating what was out there, not realizing that the zeitgeist can be a bad thing too.
Yeah, definitely. And read, the whole genre, right? Like the history of it, read about it. Like when I started reading, I came to Lovecraft, for example. I read, a few of his stories when I was a teenager, but then I really only came to Lovecraft and really start sort of seriously in my 30s. And, it opens things up and changes your perceptions when you start reading historically as well as the contemporary novels that are really great in your genre.
So let's talk about Lovecraft for a second, because I find that invariably when someone mentions him, it becomes this kind of weighted conversation. I think Lovecraft is one of those figures that stands very large in the genre, despite his own efforts to remain obscure. But it's interesting because despite the fact that I think his work has had as much influence as basically anyone in the genre, he is so out of touch both with the time he was living in and to modern sensibilities, and yet he still breaks through.
He's an alien.
He was an alien.
I just have to say, he was like, if there's proof that alien life came to Earth, it's H.P. Lovecraft, right? The guy didn't belong in society.
Not at all.
He was a maniac in some ways. He was married briefly. I don't think that turned out well. And he was.
Sonny Green did move away.
Right, very far away. I think she went to Chicago. He was, he was a bigot, and he had kind of unsavory views about everyone. He was a misanthropist as well as, I wouldn't just say he was a misogynist or a racist. I think he hated everybody kind of equally. But yeah, he, despite that, as you say, he produced some kind of groundbreaking and incredible concepts in the horror genre.
To me, the analog is he is as important to modern horror the way Arthur C. Clarke is important to modern science fiction, in that he kind of blew the doors off of people's perception of what could be done. Mm-hmm. And that's almost more important than the work. Although I love Lovecraft, not necessarily everything about the man, but the work I think stands on its own.
Right. Well, so I reviewed I think last year, a collection of Lovecraft that was introduced by Victor Laval, who just took this on straight, right through the middle, saying, as a kid, I loved him. And then I realized he was racist. And Victor Laval is African-American and basically brought up the question, what do you do when your favorite author is a bigot or is bigoted? And so I think that that's an interesting conflict to address. And I think that we can talk about it, right? I think that that's what's really great, is that we can talk about it. We all agree that's, wasn't cool. We wouldn't like to probably have dinner with him. Nobody would. But Victor's conclusion was that, we're kind of all grown-ups here, right? You can reject one side of something and accept a different side of it and have ambiguity in your relationships with the works that you're reading from the past. None of the they're not all as bad as Lovecraft, but many, writers from the past had a different paradigm that they were writing in, and we would find them as contemporaries not acceptable or not interesting, or it would be kind of so far outside of our way of thinking that, it wouldn't work. But anyway, I agree with you. I think Lovecraft is so important in the horror genre, and introduces this whole other element that I really agree. So the panel you were talking about about horror, about Gothic film, was really around a book called Nightwalkers by this guy named Bruce. I forgot his last name. Wilkes, something like that. I'm sorry, I'll find it.
I only have Nightwalkers in my notes. So
yeah, I have Nightwalkers, and then I can't remember his name. I'll remember it. Anyway, one concept that he sort of hits over and over in that book, and it's excellent. It's an excellent book. I recommend it to anyone who's listening. Is the nature of awe in horror, right? And the sort of marvelousness or the unknown, right? And I think that there's a direct line between H.P. Lovecraft and that concept in horror, like that there's not secret knowledge that we're not being given, and to discover that creates this element of our insignificance and the universe's enormity, and our place in it creates this kind of cosmic dread. That I think that's his, obviously that's his strongest link to, what many writers are still exploring in horror.
So on the Lovecraft racism problem, and it is a problem, I would just say, if anyone really loves the work but is having trouble, read the letters. Get the 5 volumes of letters collected by Arkham House and read them, because you get a much more nuanced view than I think you would otherwise. And some of it is going to condemn him, and some of it's going to have you at least understand from his perspective how he got to such a horrible place, because he was incredibly frank with his circle of friends about how he grew up, where his values came from. Some people, unfortunately, would just read some of his amateur journalism, which is where the bulk of the problem really lies, because there's some horrific stuff there that's impossible to justify. And I'm not asking anyone to justify anything. I just think that if you want a more nuanced view of the man who created these great works, listen to him. Like, go read those volumes. They're great reads, by the way, anyway. But I think that when you talk about awe, the funniest thing is it's kind of the reverse of what I said before. It's like holding the mirror to yourself, right? Is what most horror is based on. But if at some point you turn away from the mirror and look at the night sky and you realize how vast it is and how little we know, that's the other side of horror.
I think I agree. And I also think that there's an element of us in that too, right? It's knowing our place, right? This idea, I think there's a megalomania in human nature and a kind of narcissism in human nature. Maybe. And the idea of holding a mirror up to ourselves and realizing maybe we're monstrous, or maybe we're insignificant, or worst of all, maybe nobody knows we're even here. Like we're basically invisible. Like that's the kind of wonder and awe that is tied to our human experience in a way that, in a lot of, just to go back to Lovecraft, in a lot of his stories, like that realization like makes people go mad, right? No one can handle it. It's just so overwhelming that, that we're not important, that people just can't deal.
That we're going to run back to the safe and security of a new dark age. That's the exact quote. Yep. I'm still impressed by the work, and I think that's never going to change. Although I will say that there are people like Lagodi who have done incredible work to expand what he created in really, really interesting places. So Jacob did have another question for you, and that's, what are the themes that resonate most with you in horror? For me, it is familial horror.
Well, that's interesting, because I really do also explore familial horror. The Ancestor is all about that. Like, what does it mean to be connected generationally to our ancestors and humanity in general? I tend to take it, I tend to take the long view, right? In Angelology, like I tend to trace genealogies back to sort of ancient sources. And in Angelology, that went to a sort of mythological source. So I think that I'm very interested in horror mythology and archetypes, and the way that the present is shaped by the past. And in The Ancestor, I did pretty much the same thing, a very different manifestation of that, a much more stripped down one. Angelology, like when is very long and like very, lots of sort of flashbacks and mythological stories. And The Ancestor is very stripped down and kind of straightforward. It starts in one place and it ends in another. But I think that they're both looking closely at ancestral horror or familial themes. So yeah, Jacob, I feel like you should have a copy of The Ancestor because you might like it.
I think you've already sold them on it, to be honest with you. So another part of you that is, it's not just a resume piece. It probably could be its own business card line, is that you actually were a Pulitzer Prize jurist.
Yeah, I was for 2 years. I did 2019 and 2020. I was a jurist for the prize in fiction.
That is an amazing, amazing thing. So how much pressure did you put yourself on?
Well, so the first year I did it, I was just a jury member. The second year I was the chair of the committee. So it changed, right? The first year I had less pressure. But you want to do a good job, and we get hundreds of books, right? Literally hundreds and hundreds of books are submitted. And they come to there's 5 jurists, and they come to us, and we divide them up, and we don't read them cover to cover, but we do read a section or part of each one to make sure that it's worthy or not worthy. So yeah, and in the second year when I was the chair, I not only did that part of it, but I also was really out hunting for books that maybe hadn't been submitted, that I would have liked to see in, and that I did bring in more, I guess you would call it genre writing into that process. And ultimately, we didn't have a horror novel win the Pulitzer Prize. Unfortunately, that would have been awesome. But I think that they got a read, right? They got some horror novelists who were read and taken seriously, which I think is important. But yeah, it was great. It was overwhelming. I was so busy, and I was also writing, and publishing The Ancestor at the same time. So quite a busy time.
That's a horrific year, no matter what.
I know, and then the column too, right, which is 4 or 5 times a year. So,
then you breathed out, and then the pandemic hit, and the world collapsed.
Yeah, I know. And my book came out like right at the beginning of the pandemic, so that was really difficult because we had everything. I feel like we had everything set up to sell some books and to reach some new people and to really expand. Not expand horror. I don't want to be like holding a flag up for horror, but to sort of like cross over so that more people would read in that genre. And all of my events were canceled, everything. So
I think that everything got canceled this year.
Everything got canceled.
Everything. I mean, if we could, we really should consider 2021 just retitling it 2020 and trying again.
Can we just stop this?
It wouldn't be the worst thing we've done historically as a people. So just ignore that year. Just don't write about it in any history books, and just complete do-over. And I think I know why he's asking, but the question is going to seem like it's out of left field. A commenter by the name of the Zodiac Killer, who used to go under a name of Al from Russia, although he lives in Philadelphia, asks, have you seen the Suspiria remake that came out in 2018?
Which one?
Suspiria?
I don't think I did. No.
Okay. It's going to be in your wheelhouse, and that's why I think he was looking for your thoughts on it. It's very much in the vein of our conversation over the last 20 minutes.
Okay, I need to see it, obviously.
Yeah. If you haven't seen the original, I'm just, as the purist in me goes,
see that first, and then
see Argento's original first, and then
okay, I'm gonna write this down.
They're available on all major streaming platforms, so I can't imagine it'd be a problem. All right, so at this point in the genre's history, we are at a weird explosion point, whereas the top television shows can be about zombies, and the comic book industry is at least a third horror. Books are coming out, whether they're marketed as horror or not, and they're selling massive copies. And yet we still live at a time where perhaps the dignity of the genre has not been really elevated to the extent of the interest in the society. And we've talked about that, but what is your solution to fixing it? How do we get to the point whereas I don't think, look, I'm not saying that everything should be horror or everyone has to love it. Far from that. I just don't want us to be thought of as pornographers anymore.
Yeah. Well, I think just writing, for people to keep writing really good books, honestly. Like, I think that as you mentioned, there's a ton of great horror writers now who are being marketed sort of as literary horror. And that's a Trojan horse in some ways. Push it, I follow a lot of those people you mentioned, and I see sort of regular, I don't even know, like, what's your regular reader, but like the sort of regular reader that you wouldn't expect to normally be reading horror, raving about those books, really enjoying them. I think that there's a lot of great writing in this genre that has been classified in different ways to keep it out of being called horror, if that makes sense. Like, I think that, Sarah Waters, for example, I think she wrote a novel called The Little Stranger. Is it Little Stranger?
Little Stranger.
Yeah, that was adapted into that's straight up horror. She's very considered literary, right? And
Right.
That book was marketed as literary, and the label horror, I don't think, was ever on it. I think what we have to do is take back the label, or allow, take those books back, those kinds of books back, and sort of put it all together, right? And that would bring more prestige to the genre. Also, listen, like, having this column in the Times is a great thing too, because people who read every kind of book read my column. And I get letters from people who are enjoying books that they wouldn't have picked up before. So I think we're on our way. And also, I think that there's going to be, this is me just being, who knows, I'm just predicting, I have no idea if this is going to happen, but that media and culture is going to shift a lot in the next decade because of the pandemic and because of where it was going anyway, but the way that things have been collapsed into this digital space. And we're going to be reading on our Kindle, unfortunately, and then going and watching something on a tablet. And horror, if it's doing well in television and film, and in this genre, it's going to necessarily be bought by publishing houses and promoted by publishing houses because of that cross-pollination. So I think that that is a boon to us. I think there are some people that would rather keep those completely separate, right? The writing and the adaptations, and I think they can only help each other. So there's my 2 cents. I think that I think it's going to go in a good place.
So I love the fact that you're so optimistic about this, because you come from a place where you're seeing it. Again, you're on the front lines. Your column is sort of the Oprah's book club for the genre, for people who are paying attention. Well, kind of is, right?
Well, I'm glad that people read it, because the thing is I worry. And I hope no one from the Times is listening to this, or maybe I should, but I feel like a lot of millennials, right, and people who are online a lot, and they don't read that. They don't read the Times. And I would rather, I want people to read about books, and I want people to hear about horror novels. So I really hope that it somehow moves into digital culture in a way that it hasn't in the past. So,
well, books are never going to probably be the sexy new thing, right? So no. It has to be compelling on a different level. But I think we just need a few cornerstone titles to pull that off. It's not the Harry Potter thing. It's not the Twilight thing, whereas that becomes popular. Then when that's done, it's done. We need a variety of different voices, not just one voice. The media has to be a lot more diverse in how they're considering the genre. And that's exactly what you're doing. So that's really in your wheelhouse. And you're bringing perception to a lot of voices that otherwise might not get heard. So I think you're doing the important work. I hope that in some small way, those of us online who are making sure that other people get some kind of a platform
Yeah.
and also listen to people. The other thing I think that's really important is that we have to have a conversation around what really the breeders and the viewers and what they want. Because I feel like for too long, it's been very top down.
Yeah.
And
I think so too.
and it's not a matter of satisfying your customer, because I think we should challenge what people think they want, but I don't think that we should be screaming from a mountaintop that they're all imbeciles unless they like our precious art.
Yeah.
And that's the other danger, of course. But I think if we keep our nose to the ground, we still mingle with the people, and we let the conversation happen, then the best work, I think, will rise.
I think so too. I think so too. I am also, though, because my column is in the Times, right? And that is kind of, a little bit of it's a platform for the genre. I do think that there is a benefit to having some curation, right?
Oh yeah.
Like, for example, Goodreads, where anyone and their brother can just write anything that they want about anything, right? Like, I liked it because I had just eaten a barbecue sandwich and I was in a good mood and this book really made me happy, right? Like, that kind of reviewing is taking over from curation in some ways. So I do love that there's a horror column in the New York Times and that I'm writing it, and that it is a somewhat, it's a platform and it's a curated one. I go through a lot of books. I have a pretty good knowledge of the genre. I choose books that I think are amazingly written, but not, based on any one thing, right? It's character, story, writing, all of it together. So curation, I think, is important, especially in this brave new world we're moving into, where it's kind of a chaotic Wild West online, right? Like, how do people find things? And, SEO is it cannot be our curation.
No.
This is what I like. That can't be curation for art or for books or for films or whatever. So there has to be, I don't know, we just, as a culture, we're losing the sort of uniform sort of swirl of, everyone's reading this one thing or watching this one thing and everyone's doing this one thing. We all have a common culture. Now it's constellations everywhere, but I still feel like there has to be a connection between them. And so hopefully, my column and shows like yours and other people who are out there really, who are passionate about this, can be that connecting tissue. I also want to say one more thing.
Yeah,
I also really love, for the horror genre, I also really love right now audio drama. So I don't know if you or your viewers, listeners are into audio drama, but there's, that's another place that you can go for good horror or actually good fiction in general.
Yeah, I mean, so certainly, like, the Audible revolution has led in a bunch of interesting directions that aren't getting the press either.
Yeah, I wrote The Ancestor has a sort of spin-off that I wrote as an audio drama called Crypto Z, about cryptozoology. And so that's like horror sci-fi. But in the process of doing that, it's opened my eyes. There's a lot of people out there. It's an easier medium to break into than, say, film. And there's a lot of filmmakers who are making audio dramas and a lot of writers who are writing scripts for it. So it's just a very cool, interesting space at the moment.
We need more forums. That's definitely the truth.
And this is a really exciting one. It's one that was here in the 30s and 40s, like War of the Worlds, and like it was a really big thing. Yeah. And so
the British never lost it, by the way.
Right, I know, they're so popular there.
Yeah,
our show has been listened to a lot there.
They're very, very media driven, of established, television shows and film, but it's very much alive there. So maybe America just needs to look back to look forward.
Yeah, maybe.
Danielle, it's been awesome talking to you today.
Well, thank you for having me. This has been a real pleasure.
Like I told you when we were off the air, I was kind of nervous to bring you on because I actually think you're doing really important work on both sides of your career. And with that level of respect does come a little bit of trepidation. I don't want to make a complete ass of myself.
Well, thank you.
A little bit of an ass is kind of that's inside my, brand, but a lot now. But how can people continue to follow your work and follow your voice?
So, I'm on all the social media channels, I guess. Danielle Trussoni. Twitter, it's at Danny Trussoni. And then I have a website, and there's, a contact button there. You can get in touch with me. I'm happy to hear from you. Happy to send out. Actually, I have things like signed book plates and stuff if anyone wants one for their book. And then I do a kind of weekly newsletter too. So if you want to sign up for that, you can write to me, and then you'll be able to hear all of my ideas about life and horror and the world.
Sounds awesome. On this channel, we're back on Monday with the 3rd edition of our game show, Critical Pursuit. We have great panelists lined up to try to answer the questions. If you watched the previous installments, you know that it's more fun than game show at any rate. But that will be on Monday at 8 o'clock. I hope you all can join us. Go out and buy some of Danielle's books. I might even throw some Amazon links in the description. But anyway, have a great night, guys, and hopefully all your power stays on. Thank you.